I am Maynard Thompson, 65 years old, and I never thought the proudest day of my life would become my greatest heartbreak. Standing in that church watching my only son Thomas about to marry Catherine, my chest swelled with pride until those words cut through me like ice. "You are not welcome here. Go away," she hissed, her perfectly made-up face twisted with disgust. The room fell silent. My own son just stood there, saying nothing. If you are watching this video, drop a comment telling me where you are from, and subscribe if my story resonates with you. Life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. After my beloved wife Diana passed away from cancer when Thomas was just 8 years old, I promised myself I would give our son everything he needed to thrive despite his mother not being there. Diana fought hard for 2 years, but the aggressive breast cancer eventually took her from us one autumn morning. I still remember Thomas sitting by her hospital bed, holding her hand and telling her about the home run he had hit in Little League the day before. That image is burned into my memory forever. Raising a boy alone in our suburban home in Connecticut wasn't easy. I worked as an electrical engineer during the day, but took on consulting work at night after Thomas went to bed to ensure we could maintain our lifestyle. Despite the exhaustion, I never missed a Little League game, science fair, or parent-teacher conference. Those moments were sacred to me. Thomas and I developed routines that became our special bond. Every Sunday morning, we would go fishing at Lake Wintergreen. I taught him how to bait a hook, cast a line, and most importantly, how to sit in peaceful silence, appreciating nature the way my father had taught me. During those quiet moments, Thomas would sometimes ask questions about his mother, and I would share stories that kept her memory alive for him. Our bond grew stronger through his teenage years. Unlike many of his peers, Thomas never went through a rebellious phase. He was focused, determined, and kind-hearted. When he got accepted to Stanford with a partial scholarship to study computer science, I couldn't have been prouder. I sold my prized 1967 Mustang, which I had been restoring for years, to help cover the remaining tuition costs. Thomas objected, but I insisted. His education was more important than any car. Those college years were tough financially, but I worked overtime and cut expenses wherever possible. I even rented out our spare bedroom to help make ends meet. The sacrifice was worth it when Thomas graduated with honors and landed a position at TechSphere, one of the most prominent software companies in San Francisco. He had grown into an intelligent, compassionate young man with a bright future ahead of him. Diana would have been so proud. Thomas called me every Sunday night without fail. We would talk about his work, my retirement plans, and life in general. When he mentioned meeting a woman named Catherine at a company marketing event, I could hear the excitement in his voice. "She's brilliant, Dad," he said. "She runs their entire digital marketing department at only 28. You should see how everyone respects her input." I was thrilled that Thomas had found someone special. After several months of dating, he flew back home for Thanksgiving and brought Catherine along to meet me. My first impression was that she was undeniably beautiful with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes. She was charming and articulate when discussing her career accomplishments. But something felt off when the conversation turned to Thomas or his childhood. "Those fishing trips sound so primitive," she commented with a slight grimace when Thomas enthusiastically described our Sunday tradition. "I prefer activities with purpose, like networking events or charity galas." Thomas laughed it off, but I noticed how quickly he changed the subject to her recent promotion. It was subtle, but it was the first warning sign I chose to ignore for my son's happiness. Over the next year, I noticed a pattern developing. Thomas would plan to visit for a weekend, then Catherine would reschedule due to a sudden work commitment. Our Sunday calls became less frequent, often interrupted by Catherine needing Thomas for something urgent. When I sent Thomas a handcrafted wooden chess set for his birthday, Catherine called it quaint and suggested next time something more contemporary would better suit their apartment aesthetic. When I expressed mild concerns to Thomas, he became immediately defensive. "Catherine is under a lot of pressure at work, Dad. She doesn't mean anything by it. She just communicates differently than we do." The "we" in that sentence gave me hope that he still identified with our family values, but I worried about the growing influence she had over him. 13 months after they started dating, Thomas called me, bursting with excitement. "She said yes, Dad," I proposed, and Catherine said yes. He described the elaborate proposal he had orchestrated at the French restaurant where they had their first date, complete with a string quartet and champagne service. Later, I saw the professional photographs all over Catherine's social media accounts, meticulously documenting every moment of the surprise she had clearly been expecting. Thomas and Catherine flew to Connecticut the following month to discuss wedding plans. During dinner at my home, I made an offer that would change everything. "I want to pay for the wedding," I said. "It would mean so much to me to give you this gift." I had been saving for this moment since Thomas was born, setting aside funds that had grown to approximately $75,000 over the years. Catherine's eyes lit up immediately. "That's so generous, Maynard," she said, the first time she had used my first name instead of Mr. Thompson. Thomas looked concerned and started to object, but Catherine placed her hand over his. "Your father wants to do this for us, honey. We should let him." A week later, I met Catherine's parents, Harold and Judy Bailey, for dinner at an upscale restaurant in Hartford. They were clearly wealthy from Harold's investment banking career, wearing designer clothes and casually mentioning their vacation home in the Hamptons. Despite their obvious financial comfort, they contributed only token amounts to the wedding preparations, primarily offering to pay for the rehearsal dinner. "Catherine has always dreamed of her perfect wedding," Judy explained with a dismissive wave. "And now, she can have exactly what she wants, thanks to your contribution." The way she emphasized the word made it sound like I was offering pocket change rather than my life savings. Harold spent most of the evening talking about their country club connections and how they had pulled strings to secure an exclusive venue for the rehearsal. When I mentioned my career as an electrical engineer, he responded with, "That's nice. Good, solid blue-collar work. I had 2 master's degrees and had managed large teams at a Fortune 500 company before retirement, but I bit my tongue for Thomas's sake." By the end of that dinner, I understood where Catherine's attitude came from, but I was determined not to let family politics interfere with giving Thomas the wedding celebration he deserved. Little did I know how quickly things would spiral out of control. What started as a generous offer to fund a beautiful wedding gradually transformed into a financial and emotional nightmare. Catherine hired a wedding planner named Angela, who seemed to have no concept of budgetary constraints. Every time I received an update, the costs had mysteriously increased. The first major conflict arose over the venue. I had suggested the Hartford Botanical Gardens, a stunning location where my late wife and I had spent many Sunday afternoons. Thomas seemed touched by the sentiment, but Catherine immediately dismissed it. "No offense, Maynard, but we need something more sophisticated," she said, scrolling through her phone rather than making eye contact. "Angela found this chateau-style mansion that would be perfect. It is $12,000 more than the gardens, but the photos will be absolutely incredible." When I expressed concern about the escalating costs, Catherine sighed dramatically. "I thought you wanted to give Thomas a proper wedding. If money is tight for you, just say so. My parents might be able to help, though they already committed to the Hamptons renovation this year." The manipulation was clear, but I found myself agreeing to the venue change rather than appearing unable to provide for my son. Thomas remained silent during these exchanges, occasionally giving me apologetic glances but never contradicting Catherine's decisions. Next came the catering controversy. I had arranged a tasting at a well-respected local restaurant owned by an Italian family I had known for years. Catherine canceled it without consulting me. "We've already booked Elegance Catering," she informed me via text message. "Their chef trained in Paris and they specialize in modern fusion cuisine. The tasting is next Tuesday at 3. When Tuesday came, I drove 2 hours to the catering company, only to discover that my name wasn't on the guest list. We were told only the bride, groom, and the bride's mother would be attending, the receptionist explained apologetically. I called Thomas, who sounded genuinely surprised. "I had no idea, Dad. Catherine handled all the arrangements. I'm sure it was just a miscommunication." But when I arrived home, I found a social media post from Catherine showcasing the elaborately plated tasting samples with the caption, "Perfect menu selected for the big day." The pattern continued with every wedding element. The simple, elegant floral arrangements I suggested were rejected in favor of imported exotic blooms that cost triple. The 4-piece band I recommended was dismissed for a 12-piece orchestra. Catherine even insisted on flying in a cake designer from New York rather than using the local bakery that had made Thomas's graduation cake. Each time I tried to have a serious conversation with Thomas about the escalating costs or Catherine's behavior, he seemed increasingly distant. "Catherine just has excellent taste, Dad. "She knows what works best for this kind of event," became his standard response, as if reciting lines he'd been taught. One Sunday, I drove to Thomas's apartment hoping to have a heart-to-heart conversation while Catherine was at a bridesmaid's brunch. I brought photo albums and keepsakes, including his mother's pearl cufflinks that I hoped he would wear for the ceremony. "Your mother would have wanted you to have these," I said, opening the velvet box. For a moment, I saw the old Thomas as his eyes misted over. "Dad, he began, but the door opened and Catherine walked in unexpectedly. "What's going on here?" she asked, eyeing the box suspiciously. "Dad brought Mom's cufflinks for me to wear at the wedding," Thomas explained. Catherine's expression tightened. "Oh, but we've already ordered the custom platinum cufflinks to match the groomsmen." She turned to me with a practiced, sympathetic expression. "It's sweet that you brought these, but we have a very specific aesthetic planned. Maybe Thomas can wear them for a less formal occasion?" The pearl cufflinks were returned to their box, and the moment was gone. Thomas quickly changed the subject to safe territory, asking about my garden while Catherine busied herself on her phone, clearly disengaged from our conversation. As the wedding date approached, I discovered that I hadn't been invited to the engagement party organized by Catherine's friends. When I mentioned this to Thomas, he seemed genuinely embarrassed. "It was just a small thing with Catherine's work colleagues," he explained unconvincingly. Later, I saw the lavish event documented across social media, with Thomas surrounded by at least 60 guests, including his friends from college that I had known for years. The wedding costs had now ballooned to $110,000, far exceeding my original budget. I had dipped into my retirement savings to cover the difference, something I kept from Thomas to avoid adding stress. The financial strain was significant, but the emotional toll of being systematically excluded from wedding planning while funding it entirely was becoming unbearable. At the rehearsal dinner, which Catherine's parents hosted at their country club, I discovered I had not been included in the speeches. Harold, Judy, and Catherine's maid of honor all spoke, but when I approached the wedding planner about adding my name, she seemed flustered. "The speaking schedule was finalized by Catherine weeks ago," she explained. Adding another speech would disrupt the timeline she approved. Later that evening, I overheard Catherine complaining about me to her bridesmaids near the restrooms. "Thomas's dad is so controlling about everything," she said, unaware of my presence around the corner. "Thank God this will all be over soon, and we won't have to deal with his outdated opinions anymore. The man wears the same boring suit to everything." One of her friends asked, "Are you still planning to move forward with the other thing after the honeymoon?" To which Catherine responded with a laugh, "Absolutely. Distance makes the heart grow less annoying. Thomas will adjust." I walked away before being discovered, my heart heavy with the realization that Catherine was planning something that would likely separate me further from my son after the wedding. Despite everything, I decided to swallow my pride one more time. The next day was Thomas's wedding, and I was determined to maintain peace for his sake, even as my concerns about his future happiness grew stronger by the hour. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect early summer weather, sunshine streaming through scattered clouds. I woke before dawn, too anxious to sleep, and spent time looking through old photographs of Thomas growing up. I had compiled a special album chronicling his journey from a gap-toothed kindergartner to college graduate, including several precious pictures with Diana before her illness. I wrapped it carefully, hoping to give it to Thomas during a quiet moment before the ceremony. I arrived at the luxurious estate 2 hours early as requested by the wedding coordinator. The grounds were a flurry of activity, with florists arranging elaborate displays and catering staff setting up serving stations for the cocktail hour. The cost of everything surrounding me was staggering, but I reminded myself this was for Thomas. I found my son in a sitting room designated for the groom's party, already dressed except for his tie and jacket. When he saw me, his face lit up with genuine warmth for the first time in months. "Dad, you made it," he said, embracing me tightly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, my throat tightening with emotion. We had a rare moment of connection as I helped him with his tie, just as I had done before his first high school dance. I presented him with the photo album, and we sat together on the leather sofa flipping through pages of memories. When we reached a photo of Thomas at age 10 sitting on a hospital bed beside Diana, both of them smiling despite the circumstances, Thomas grew quiet. "I wish Mom could be here today," he whispered. "She is, son. She would be so proud of the man you've become." I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the depth of our shared loss in that moment. The door suddenly swung open, and Catherine appeared wearing a silk robe, her hair partially styled. Her makeup was flawless, but her expression darkened when she saw us looking at the album. "Thomas, the photographer needs you for the pre-ceremony shots with the groomsmen," she said sharply, not acknowledging my presence. "That should have started 10 minutes ago." "We were just reminiscing a bit," Thomas explained, closing the album. "Looking at some pictures with my dad." Catherine's eyes flicked to the album dismissively. "There will be plenty of time for old pictures later. Right now we have a schedule to keep. The coordinator is freaking out." Thomas stood obediently, straightening his vest. "Sorry, Dad. Duty calls." He squeezed my shoulder before following Catherine out, leaving the album behind on the sofa. I noticed he hadn't actually taken a single photo with the photographer yet, making me wonder if Catherine had simply wanted to interrupt our moment. I retreated to the main hall where guests would soon begin arriving. Over the next hour, I observed Catherine's increasingly erratic behavior as she snapped at vendors and bridesmaids alike. When the florist delivered the bridal bouquet, Catherine became visibly upset. "I specifically asked for pure white peonies, and these have the faintest pink center," she hissed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is completely unacceptable for the photographs." The young florist looked mortified, explaining that pure white peonies were out of season and these were the closest available match despite being specially ordered from Holland. Catherine demanded they be replaced immediately, though the ceremony was less than 2 hours away. Seeing the poor florist's distress, I approached carefully. "Is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps I could drive to another florist and see what they have available." Before the florist could respond, Catherine's mother Judy intervened. "This is being handled by professionals, Maynard. Your assistance isn't required." Her tone made it clear I was overstepping an invisible boundary. I nodded politely and moved away, increasingly uncomfortable with the tension permeating what should have been a joyous occasion. The guests began arriving, and I greeted old friends and Thomas's college roommates, momentarily finding comfort in genuine conversations. As the ceremony time grew closer, I realized I hadn't seen Thomas in over an hour. Concerned that he might be feeling overwhelmed, I decided to check on him. I asked a staff member where the groom's room was located, as we had moved from the original sitting area for the ceremony setup. The young woman pointed down a hallway. "Last door on the left, sir." I walked down the corridor, turned left as instructed, and opened the door without knocking, assuming I would find Thomas and his groomsmen. Instead, I found myself in what was clearly the bridal suite. Catherine stood in her wedding gown, surrounded by bridesmaids and her mother, all of whom turned to stare at me in shock. "I am so sorry." I immediately apologized, backing toward the door. I was looking for Thomas. Catherine's face contorted with rage. "What are you doing? You know the groom isn't supposed to see the bride before the ceremony. Are you trying to ruin everything?" "It was an honest mistake," I explained. "Someone directed me to the wrong room." "Wrong room?" Catherine advanced toward me, her voice rising. "Or were you spying? Trying to insert yourself where you don't belong, just like you've been doing this entire time?" Her accusation was so absurd that I was momentarily speechless. Catherine interpreted my silence as guilt and continued her tirade, her voice growing louder with each word. "You've been interfering from day one, trying to make this wedding about you and your precious memories instead of about us. I am sick of accommodating your outdated ideas and budget concerns when my parents could have handled everything perfectly without your input." Judy placed a hand on Catherine's arm, glancing nervously toward the partially open door where guests might overhear. "Catherine, perhaps this isn't the time." But Catherine was beyond restraint. "No, Mother, I'm done pretending. I've had enough of his constant presence, his opinions, his old-fashioned values being forced on us." She turned back to me, eyes blazing. "You are not welcome here. Go away." The room fell silent. One of the bridesmaids gasped audibly. I stood frozen, feeling as though I had been physically struck. Before I could respond, the door opened fully, and Thomas appeared, clearly having heard the commotion. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Catherine and me with confusion. Catherine immediately softened her expression, tears appearing on command. "Your father barged in here deliberately, Thomas. He's trying to ruin our special day because he can't stand not being the center of attention." I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, to recognize the absurdity of her claim. Instead, he sighed heavily and turned to me with an expression of disappointment. "Dad, maybe you should wait outside," he said quietly. Those 6 words cut deeper than Catherine's outburst. My own son, whom I had raised alone, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally, was dismissing me based on a blatant lie. I searched his face for any sign of the boy I had raised, but found only a stranger who had chosen his loyalty. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Catherine's reflection in the mirror. Behind Thomas's back, she wore a smirk of triumph, all traces of her manufactured tears gone. In that moment, I understood that this had been her plan all along, to create a scenario where I would be publicly humiliated and excluded. I walked through the hallway past curious wedding guests who had obviously overheard the confrontation. My brother Paul tried to stop me, concern evident on his face, but I gently shook off his hand and continued toward the exit. The beautiful June day that had started with such promise now felt cold as I made my way to the parking lot, the weight of betrayal heavy on my shoulders. Sitting in my car, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, overwhelming in their intensity. Shock gave way to hurt, which quickly transformed into a simmering anger I had rarely experienced in my 65 years. This was no longer about a wedding. It was about respect, family bonds, and refusing to be treated as nothing more than a checkbook by a woman who clearly intended to separate my son from his roots once she had extracted everything of value from me. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. As I sat in my car, the air conditioning doing little to cool the heat of my emotions, memories flooded back like a slideshow of sacrifices. I remembered staying up until 2 in the morning helping Thomas with his science project after working a 12-hour day. I recalled the Christmas when I sold my collectible coin set to buy him the computer he needed for coding classes. Most vividly, I remembered selling my vintage 1967 Mustang, a car I had spent years restoring with my own hands, to help pay for his first semester at Stanford. The Mustang memory hit hardest. Thomas had been so upset when he found out, insisting he would take out additional loans instead. "Dad, you love that car. You've worked on it for years," he had protested. I had simply told him, "I love you more than any car, son. Your future matters more to me than anything." The Thomas I raised would never have stood silently while someone disrespected his father. Catherine had changed him, slowly and systematically. A clarity washed over me as I started the engine. Catherine had never wanted a relationship with me. She had merely tolerated my presence while planning to use me financially and then create distance between Thomas and me once the wedding was over. I had overheard her plans myself at the rehearsal dinner. Her outburst wasn't a momentary loss of composure. It was the culmination of months of calculated manipulation. I pulled out my phone and the folder containing all the wedding payment information. As the primary financier of this $110,000 spectacle, my name and credit card were attached to nearly every vendor contract. Taking a deep breath, I made the first call to the credit card company. "This is Maynard Thompson. I need to discuss some potentially fraudulent charges on my account," I began, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The representative, a woman named Denise, was surprisingly understanding after I explained the situation. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Mr. Thompson. Unfortunately, we see family financial disputes more often than you might think. I can place a hold on any pending charges right away." With Denise's help, I was able to cancel payments that hadn't yet processed, including the final venue balance and the catering remainder that was scheduled to be charged after the event. Next, I called Frank, the venue manager, who happened to be a former colleague from my professional days. "Frank, it's Maynard Thompson. I have an unusual situation with Thomas's wedding today." I explained what had transpired as objectively as possible. Frank's response was immediately supportive. "Maynard, I've known you for 20 years. You're one of the most reasonable men I've ever met. If you're being treated this way, I'm both sorry and angry on your behalf." He paused before adding, "Technically, since your credit card payment is now on hold, we would be within our rights to suspend services immediately." "What would that mean practically?" I asked. "Well, they could stay for the ceremony since that's already set up, but the reception, catering, bar service, all that would be suspended unless new payment arrangements are made. And honestly, I'd be happy to make that call given how you've been treated." I thought about it for a moment. "Let me contact the other vendors first. I'll call you back in 15 minutes with my decision." Next was the catering company, where I spoke with the owner, Maria. Unlike Frank, she had no personal connection to me, but her professional sympathy was evident. "Mr. Thompson, Our contract is with you, not the bride or groom. If you're canceling our services due to being forcibly removed from the event you're financing, that's your right. We would need a 50% cancellation fee as per the contract. That's fair, I agreed, authorizing the reduced payment. When would you need to know my final decision? The staff is already on site beginning preparations, but the main food service doesn't start for another 2 hours. We need to know within the hour. The conversations with the DJ, photographer, and florist followed similar patterns. Each was professional, if somewhat uncomfortable with the situation, but all confirmed that since I was the contracting party, I had the right to cancel services. The photographer, a young woman named Alicia, was particularly empathetic. "My dad helped pay for my wedding last year," she said. "I can't imagine treating him the way you described. For what it's worth, I think you're making a tough but justified choice." The florist was actually relieved given Catherine's earlier behavior about the bouquet. "She made my assistant cry over a barely perceptible pink tint in the peonies," she confided. "We've already provided all the ceremony arrangements, but we can withhold the reception centerpieces and decorations." By the time I had spoken with all 5 major vendors, less than 45 minutes had passed since Catherine's outburst. I called Frank back at the venue. "I've decided to cancel all reception services," I told him. "The ceremony can proceed since those arrangements are complete, but I won't be funding the celebration afterward." "Understood," Frank replied soberly. "I'll make sure the staff knows. And Maynard, for what it's worth, I hope Thomas comes to his senses. He was a good kid. He still is." "Somewhere underneath her influence," I said, surprising myself with the lack of bitterness in my voice. "This isn't about punishing him. It's about finally standing up for myself." No sooner had I ended the call with Frank than my phone began ringing. It was Angela, the wedding planner Catherine had hired. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice tense and higher-pitched than normal. "We have a situation. The venue manager just informed me that all reception services have been canceled and the caterers are packing up their equipment. What is going on?" "Exactly what Catherine wanted," I replied calmly. "She made it very clear that I'm not welcome at this wedding, despite financing it entirely. I'm simply respecting her wishes by removing myself completely from the event, including my financial participation. But the guests are already arriving. The ceremony is set to start in 30 minutes. Angela's professional composure was cracking. "This is a disaster." "I understand this puts you in a difficult position, Angela. I apologize for that." However, Catherine's parents seemed quite confident they could have handled everything perfectly without my input. Now they have the opportunity to demonstrate that. Before Angela could respond, I received a text message from Thomas. "Dad, what's happening?" "Frank says the reception is canceled?" I composed a simple response. "Ask your bride why I left." More calls came flooding in, which I sent to voicemail. I had made my decision and taken action not out of revenge, but out of a newfound respect for myself. For months, I had allowed Catherine and her family to dismiss, belittle, and manipulate me while accepting my financial support. That pattern ended today. As I drove away from the venue, I felt no triumph or vindication, only a heavy sadness mixed with the quiet certainty that I had finally done what was necessary to maintain my self-respect. I had stood up for myself in the face of cruelty, even when it meant potentially losing my relationship with my only son. I could only hope that someday Thomas would understand why I had been forced to take such drastic action. By the time I arrived home, my phone showed 27 missed calls and 43 text messages. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and sat in my favorite armchair, emotionally exhausted but oddly calm. The house felt unusually quiet, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the minutes that would have been my son's wedding reception. I had just made a cup of tea when the doorbell rang, followed by insistent knocking. Opening the door, I found my younger brother Paul standing there, still wearing his wedding attire, his tie loosened and a concerned expression on his face. "Are you okay, Maynard?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I left right after you did. That was quite a scene." "I'm managing," I replied, leading him to the living room. "Would you like some tea, or something stronger?" "Definitely something stronger," Paul said, loosening his tie further. "You've got everyone in an uproar, you know. Catherine's father is threatening to sue you for breach of contract." I poured us both a small measure of bourbon. "His legal threats don't concern me. I've spoken with the vendors, and they've confirmed that since my name is on the contracts, I have every right to cancel the services, particularly after being asked to leave." Paul took a thoughtful sip. "What happened after I left?" Catherine completely lost it when the caterers started packing up. She was screaming at the wedding planner, demanding that her parents step in financially, but apparently they didn't bring their checkbooks to the wedding. Paul shook his head in disbelief. "Thomas kept asking where you were, but Catherine insisted you had stormed off in a jealous rage because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention." I winced at the thought of Thomas believing such a blatant mischaracterization. Did he believe her? At first, maybe. But then the venue manager pulled him aside for a private conversation. I couldn't hear what was said, but Thomas looked shocked afterward. Paul leaned forward. "Here's the thing, Maynard. I've been watching Catherine interact with Thomas for months, and something isn't right. The way she controls him, isolates him. It's not healthy." The phone rang again, and I glanced at the caller ID. It was Bernard Collins, my attorney and longtime friend. I answered, putting him on speaker so Paul could hear. "Maynard, I just received a rather unpleasant call from someone named Harold Bailey who claims to be your future-in-law, or was supposed to be, until you, and I quote, maliciously sabotaged his daughter's wedding in a petty act of revenge." "Hello to you too, Bernard," I replied wearily. "I suppose he's threatening legal action?" "Indeed he is. Before I get into the legal aspects, are you all right? This doesn't sound like you at all." I recounted the events of the day, while Bernard listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. "Well," he finally said, "from a legal standpoint, you're on solid ground. The contracts are in your name, you made the payments, and you were effectively expelled from an event you were financing. Harold can bluster all he wants, but no judge would rule against you, especially if we have witnesses to the bride's behavior." "I was there," Paul interjected, "along with at least 10 other guests who overheard everything." "Excellent," Bernard replied. "Now, Maynard, have you heard from Thomas directly yet?" "Just one text asking what was happening. I told him to ask Catherine why I left." Well, brace yourself. I suspect there will be fallout once the dust settles." After Bernard hung up, Paul stayed for another hour, providing moral support and additional details about the chaos that had ensued after my departure. Apparently, Catherine's parents had tried to salvage the reception by offering to pay with credit cards, but the combined spending limits were insufficient for the outstanding balances. Most guests had left after an abbreviated ceremony, with only Catherine's closest friends and family remaining for an improvised celebration with whatever food and beverages were already on site. Late that evening, my phone rang again. It was Jake Donovan, Thomas's best man and friend since college. "Mr. Thompson," he began hesitantly, "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "Of course, Jake. How are you holding up?" "Honestly, this whole day has been a nightmare. That's actually why I'm calling. There's something you should know." Jake paused, seemingly gathering courage. "Last night at the bachelor party, Thomas stepped away, and Catherine's maid of honor, Brittany, was talking to some of the bridesmaids. She didn't know I could hear them." My stomach tightened. "What did you hear, Jake?" "She was talking about Catherine's plan to gradually cut you out of Thomas's life after the wedding. Apparently, Catherine has been complaining for months about your influence on Thomas, saying she needed to, and I quote, program him away from his daddy's antiquated values. They were laughing about how once they moved to Seattle for Catherine's new job promotion, they'd be far enough away that visits would be difficult." I closed my eyes, the confirmation of my suspicions bringing no satisfaction. "Does Thomas know about this move to Seattle?" "That's just it, Mr. Thompson. I don't think he does. When he mentioned visiting you over Thanksgiving in one of our conversations last week, Catherine quickly changed the subject. I got the impression she hadn't told him about her plans yet. After Jake's call, I received a text message from an unknown number. It contained screenshots of a conversation between Catherine and her maid of honor, Brittany. The text chain discussed strategies for getting rid of the old man once we have the wedding and making sure Thomas understands where his priorities need to be. The screenshots were followed by a message. "Thomas should see these. Catherine isn't who he thinks she is. Some of us bridesmaids are uncomfortable with how she talks about you and manipulates him." I saved the screenshots but decided not to forward them to Thomas immediately. Using her friend's betrayal as ammunition would only make me appear vindictive. If Thomas and I were to have any chance of rebuilding our relationship, it needed to happen through honest communication, not through exposing Catherine's duplicity. Around 11 that night, my phone rang again. It was Thomas. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hello, son." "Dad." His voice sounded strained, exhausted. "I don't even know where to begin." "You don't have to begin anywhere, Thomas. I understand you're in a difficult position. Do you have any idea what you've done?" A trace of anger colored his words. "Catherine is devastated. Her perfect day was ruined." "I'm sorry you didn't get the celebration you deserved," I said sincerely. "But I need to ask you something, Thomas. Do you truly believe I would have taken such drastic action without extreme provocation?" There was a long pause. "Catherine said you were jealous of her relationship with me, that you couldn't handle not being the center of attention anymore. Is that what you believe, after everything we've been through together?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything happened so fast. Thomas, I have loved you unconditionally since the moment you were born. I have supported your dreams, respected your choices, and yes, financed your wedding despite increasing disrespect from Catherine and her family. But when your bride screamed at me to leave my own son's wedding and you stood by silently, a line was crossed that I cannot uncross." "She was just stressed," Thomas began, but the defense sounded hollow even to himself. "The wedding planning has been really hard on her. A wedding is one day. A marriage is a lifetime. If this is how she treats family she disagrees with during a happy occasion, what happens when real challenges arise?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I need some time to think, Dad. This is all too much right now." "I understand. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." I hesitated, then added, "I love you, son. That hasn't changed and never will." He hung up without saying it back, which hurt more than I wanted to admit. But beneath the pain, I sensed confusion in his voice rather than conviction. He wasn't defending Catherine with the blind devotion I had witnessed over recent months. For the first time, he seemed to be questioning her version of events. As I prepared for bed that night, I updated my will with an email to Bernard, not out of spite but out of pragmatism. If Thomas chose Catherine and her manipulations over our relationship, I needed to be prepared for that possibility. I would always love my son, but I couldn't force him to see what was happening if he wasn't ready. I went to sleep that night with no certainty about what the future would bring, but with the quiet dignity of knowing I had finally stood up for myself when it mattered most. 3 days passed with no further contact from Thomas. I resumed my normal routine as best I could, tending to my vegetable garden and attending my weekly chess game at the community center, all while carrying a heaviness in my chest that made each activity feel mechanical rather than enjoyable. I received occasional updates from Paul, who reported that Thomas and Catherine had canceled their honeymoon to Hawaii and were staying at her parents' house. Bernard had drafted a formal response to Harold Bailey's legal threats, a thoroughly researched document explaining why any lawsuit would be frivolous. This should put an end to his blustering, Bernard assured me over lunch. Most wealthy businessmen like Harold know when to cut their losses rather than throw good money after bad. We also updated my will and financial documents, a process I had been putting off for years. Just in case things don't improve with Thomas, I explained to Bernard, who nodded sympathetically. "For what it's worth, Maynard, I think the boy will come around eventually." The Thomas I met at his law school graduation didn't strike me as someone who could be permanently manipulated, even by someone as controlling as Catherine seems to be. I wanted to believe Bernard was right, but with each passing day of silence, my hope dimmed slightly. I had begun to mentally prepare for a future where Thomas was no longer part of my life, a prospect that left me feeling hollow despite my certainty that I had done the right thing. On the third night after the wedding disaster, I was reading in my study when the doorbell rang at 11:15. It was unusual to have visitors so late, and I approached the door cautiously, looking through the peephole. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Thomas stood on my porch, his normally neat appearance disheveled, hair uncombed and wearing a rumpled t-shirt and jeans. Most shocking were his red-rimmed eyes and the small suitcase at his feet. I opened the door immediately. "Thomas, are you all right?" I asked, instinctively reaching out. To my surprise, he stepped forward and embraced me tightly, something he hadn't done unprompted since he was a teenager. I felt him trembling slightly as I returned the hug, concern flooding through me. "Can I come in, Dad?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course," I replied, taking his suitcase and ushering him inside. "Are you hungry? I can make you something." He shook his head, following me to the living room where he sank onto the couch, looking utterly depleted. I sat across from him, waiting patiently while he gathered his thoughts. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "A massive, unforgivable apology." "Thomas." "No, please let me say this," he interrupted, straightening his posture. "I should have defended you at the wedding. I should have stepped in when Catherine spoke to you that way. There is no excuse for my silence." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been blind, Dad. So blind to what's been happening." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "What changed, Thomas?" He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "After the wedding fell apart, Catherine was hysterical, blaming you for everything. Her parents were threatening lawsuits, talking about how they would make you pay." He took a deep breath. "But then Jake pulled me aside and asked if I knew about Catherine's plans to move us to Seattle after the honeymoon." "Seattle?" I asked, feigning surprise to protect Jake. "Yes, apparently she accepted a job there months ago without discussing it with me. When I confronted her, she acted like it wasn't a big deal, that I could find work anywhere, and being away from Connecticut, away from you, would be healthy for our marriage." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "That's when I started questioning everything, including her version of what happened at the wedding." Thomas went on to explain how he had spoken privately with several wedding guests, including his groomsmen who had witnessed Catherine's outburst. Everyone told the same story. "Dad, Catherine didn't just ask you to leave, she publicly humiliated you after you accidentally walked into the wrong room. No one could understand why I had stood there silently." The truth of what had been happening gradually emerged through our conversation. Catherine had been systematically manipulating Thomas for months, telling him that I had been making disparaging remarks about her family behind her back, claiming I had called her gold digger to my friends, and insisting that I was trying to control their lives through financial support. She would tell me things you supposedly said, and when I'd question her, she'd get upset, asking why I didn't trust her, Thomas explained, shame evident in his expression. Eventually, I stopped questioning and just accepted her version of everything. I can't believe I let this happen. As the night progressed, Thomas revealed more about the aftermath of the wedding. Catherine had expected her parents to immediately cover all the canceled services, but they had balked at the cost. When Thomas suggested rescheduling a smaller, more modest ceremony, Catherine had become enraged. She said if I wasn't willing to give her the perfect wedding she deserved, then maybe I wasn't husband material after all, he recounted. Then she gave me an ultimatum. Either I convince you to pay for another full wedding exactly as she planned, or I cut you out of my life entirely. What did you say to that? I asked quietly. I asked her why those were the only options. Why couldn't we just plan something we could afford ourselves? Thomas's expression hardened slightly. She said, and I'll never forget this, because I'm not marrying a man who shops the clearance rack. Either you're a provider or you're a daddy's boy forever. Those cruel words had finally broken the spell Catherine had cast over my son. In the aftermath of their argument, Thomas had discovered more lies, including emails proving Catherine had deliberately excluded me from wedding planning meetings while blaming it on miscommunications. He had ended their engagement that afternoon. I know I've hurt you, Dad. I chose her over you repeatedly, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Thomas looked down at his hands. I don't expect you to forgive me either, but I needed you to know that I see the truth now. I see what she was doing to us. I moved to sit beside him on the couch, placing my hand on his shoulder. Thomas, you are my son. There is nothing to forgive. You fell in love, and love can be blinding. What matters is that you found your way back to yourself. Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his face. I brought some things with me, I was hoping. I was wondering if I could stay here for a while, just until I figure out what's next. This is your home, Thomas. It always has been, and always will be. We stayed up until dawn, talking with an honesty we hadn't shared in years. Thomas asked questions about his mother, about my own struggles raising him alone, topics he had avoided during his relationship with Catherine. As the sun rose, casting golden light through the windows, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The road to healing our relationship would be long, but we had taken the first crucial steps. I'm going to make us some breakfast, I said, standing and stretching my stiff muscles. And then we both need some sleep. Thomas nodded, exhaustion evident in his face but a certain peace there too. Thanks, Dad, for everything. for not giving up on me even when I gave you every reason to. As I prepared eggs and toast in the familiar kitchen, where I had made countless meals for Thomas throughout his childhood, I felt profound gratitude. What had begun as one of the worst days of my life had ultimately led to an unexpected gift: the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. 6 months passed, bringing autumn leaves and cooler temperatures to Connecticut. Thomas had transformed our basement into a temporary home office where he was working remotely for a new software company based in Boston. The position paid less than his previous job, but the reduced pressure seemed to agree with him. The haunted look that had lingered in his eyes after the wedding debacle had gradually faded. Weekly therapy sessions had become an important part of his healing journey. Dr. Lillian Ross specialized in helping people recover from manipulative relationships, and she had helped Thomas recognize the patterns of emotional abuse that had been present with Catherine. "It's like having a fog lifted," he told me, after one particularly significant session. "I can see so clearly now how she isolated me from everyone who truly cared about me." I too had begun seeing a counselor, Dr. Marcus Jenkins, who helped me process the complex emotions surrounding nearly losing my son to Catherine's manipulation. "You're allowed to feel anger, Maynard," he reminded me during one session. "Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending you weren't deeply hurt." The healing process wasn't linear for either of us. There were difficult conversations where old wounds were reopened, moments of frustration when progress seemed slow, and occasional setbacks when Thomas would doubt his decision to end the relationship. Catherine had attempted to contact him several times in the first months, alternating between tearful pleas for reconciliation and vicious accusations. "She sent an email claiming I abandoned her because I couldn't handle a strong woman," Thomas shared one evening. "Last week I might have believed her, but today I can recognize it for what it is, another manipulation tactic." Gradually, Thomas reconnected with friends Catherine had deemed not good enough for their social circle. His college roommate David visited for a weekend, bringing his wife and toddler son. Thomas's best man Jake became a regular visitor for Sunday football games. These renewed friendships provided Thomas with perspective on how isolated he had become during his relationship with Catherine. Paul and his wife Sarah invited us for dinner regularly, creating a supportive family environment that helped Thomas remember who he was before Catherine. During one such dinner, Sarah, who worked in human resources, mentioned a software development position opening at her company. "They're looking for someone with exactly your experience, Thomas," she said. "And the best part is, it's right here in Hartford. No relocation required." Thomas applied and was offered the job 2 weeks later, a positive step toward rebuilding his independent life while maintaining our strengthened relationship. He found an apartment 10 minutes from my house, close enough for regular visits but with the healthy separation we both recognized he needed. 3 months after the wedding disaster, we received unexpected news through the grapevine. Catherine had become engaged to a successful dermatologist she had apparently been keeping in her back pocket. "They announced it on social media just 12 weeks after our breakup," Thomas said, showing me the post on his phone. His expression was contemplative rather than bitter. "You know what's strange? I feel sorry for him. He has no idea what's coming." That moment marked a significant milestone in Thomas's recovery. He could now see Catherine's behavior objectively, without the emotional entanglement that had clouded his judgment for so long. It was as if discussing her engagement freed him from the last vestiges of her influence. As we approached the holiday season, Thomas surprised me one evening with an unexpected gift. He placed a small box on the kitchen table while I was preparing dinner. "What's this?" I asked, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Open it," he said, an unusual nervousness in his voice. Inside the box was a set of keys attached to a leather keychain engraved with the Ford Mustang logo. "Thomas, what did you do?" I asked, confused. "I tracked down your 1967 Mustang," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "The guy you sold it to had kept it in perfect condition. It took some negotiating, but he agreed to sell it back." Thomas swallowed hard. "I can never repay everything you've sacrificed for me, Dad, but I thought maybe this could be a start." I was speechless, holding the keys to the car I had loved and willingly given up for my son's education. The gesture represented so much more than the return of a material possession. It symbolized Thomas's deep understanding of the sacrifices I had made, his appreciation for our history, and his commitment to our future relationship. "There's something else," Thomas added, pulling out a brochure. "I've started a small foundation in Mom's name to help single parents with college expenses for their kids. It's not huge yet, just funded with some of my savings, but I'm hoping it will grow." That night, as we took the restored Mustang for a drive through our hometown, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from what had initially seemed like tragedy. The wedding disaster had been painful beyond words, but it had ultimately saved Thomas from a lifetime with someone who didn't truly love or respect him, and it had given us the opportunity to build a more authentic relationship than we'd had in years. As a father, I had always tried to protect Thomas from pain, but I realized now that some lessons can only be learned through difficult experiences. Thomas had emerged from this ordeal stronger, more self-aware, and with a deeper appreciation for genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. For my part, I had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself, even at the risk of losing someone you love, is necessary for preserving your dignity and self-respect. By refusing to be Catherine's silent checkbook, I had modeled for Thomas the importance of maintaining boundaries, even in the face of potential loss. Our relationship had evolved into something deeper than the traditional father-son dynamic. We had become friends who respected each other as adults, who could disagree without fear, and who recognized the value of honesty even when it was uncomfortable. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Thomas and I sat on the back porch watching fireflies illuminate the summer evening. "You know, Dad," he said thoughtfully, "I used to think love meant never having conflict, always agreeing with whatever made the other person happy." Catherine reinforced that by punishing me whenever I disagreed with her. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "But I've learned that real love includes respect," he continued. "Respect for differences, respect for boundaries, respect for each other's inherent worth." He turned to look at me directly. "Thank you for showing me that through your actions, even when I couldn't see it." As I sit here reflecting on our journey, I realize that sometimes what appears to be our greatest heartbreak can become the foundation for unexpected growth. By standing firm in your own worth, you not only preserve your dignity, but also demonstrate to those you love what healthy relationships truly require. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey has resonated with you in any way, please consider subscribing to hear more life lessons from an old man who's still learning every day. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement to recognize their own worth. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most beautiful destinations.